Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson, back with our mini-series, Longevity for Investors, with my great co-host, Dr. Greg Bailey. If you don't know Dr. Bailey, he was part of the team that packaged together Medivation, which had the incredible standout drug Extendi, sold for $14 billion. And then next, Biohaven, which had Nurtec, sold for $11 billion. These days, he's got a hub and spoke company, Juvenescence, in the longevity space, which I think is pretty incredible. And this is an incredibly fun series where I get to learn from both him and these great guests. Greg, why don't you introduce our guest?
Yeah, Dr. Ahmad is that rare combination of scientist with Wall Street background as well, and in one of the sexiest sectors. And his postdoc has been done with some very established, exciting people. Thank you for being on the show, Faizzan. And what did I miss in describing you?
Absolutely a privilege. No, you're pretty on point and accurate. I've been very, very fortunate, right, to have been mentored by what I call giants in the field, and throughout my career, that's sort of been my guiding light. And to that vein, I call on to our friendship and our mentorship from you as in that same light, right?
Why don't you touch on a couple of the mentors? Because I think that's important to establish the area we're about to speak about, regeneration.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so I guess maybe I can take it a step back and tell you a little bit why I got started into research, and then sort of carried on to building that career in this space, particularly in regenerative medicine. And so just briefly, my mother in 2001 had a seizure that caused her to have a cardiac arrest. That cardiac arrest then led her heart stopping, which is exactly what a cardiac arrest is, and then she lost oxygenation in the brain, and that what that caused was essentially her brain was dead, and she was on a respirator to help her breathe for about 10 months, and then she passed away. And so at the time, I was a high school student, actually. And so I was looking at, okay, what can we do so that someone else like myself, as a 15-year-old, I've got an older brother who's 18 and a sister at the time who was 8 years old. And so what do I do to sort of make sure that someone else like myself doesn't have to go through this? And so so I'm from Queens, New York, and transportation is pretty easy. And so I figured, why not try to reach out to some of the leading scientists that I could potentially work in the lab with. And one of those individuals happened to be in the regenerative medicine space. At that time, I probably hadn't discovered the full potential of stem cell biology, right? And so I worked with a guy named David Sassoon, who I later found out was considered as, well, I'm going to quote Darcy Kelly, who's a professor at Columbia, a developmental biologist at Columbia, who said he worked with the father of myology, or muscle biology, and he was one of the early guys who discovered the MyoD transcription factors. And at the time, he was at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, who was very warm and welcoming for a high school student, where I thought I was just going to be washing dishes. But it turned out to be so much more. And we were working on really, really neat genetic tools, utilizing at the time different constructs of a gene called PW1. And PW1, surprisingly, there is a correlation between PW1 as well as aging, at least when it comes to stem cell biology. But I guess we can take that discussion offline. Nonetheless, PW1, I was making fragments of PW1 to see what its transcription or regulatory role was in muscle biology, particularly in its marking of satellite stem cells, which is the body's adult resident stem cell that gives you when old muscle becomes old and your body needs to form new muscle. Those satellite cells are the cells that become muscle fibers, and that as you age, right, becomes less efficient. And that's why you have, sarcopenia, for instance. And
Can I
so,
stop you for 1 minute, just for the audience? Sarcopenia is the aging of the muscular system and the loss of muscle as we age, and it's a huge problem with those Ozempic, Mounjaro, the diabetes drugs. So 15 to 20% of all the weight you lose is unfortunately muscle, which is catastrophic as you get older because you're already losing muscle at a pretty good clip. Sorry, back to you, Faizzan.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so, it was David who actually inspired me. And I guess I can also fast forward in the future a bit on this one. It actually led me to really put some heavyweight capital around a company that we spun out of Johns Hopkins called Vita Therapeutics, which I have the privilege of sitting with Vlad Korich, who you're very familiar with.
Yeah, I know, Vlad.
Biohaven CEO, who sat on the board together to spin out this company called Vita Therapeutics, operating around the concept of taking induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSCs, and transforming them into muscle stem cells, and then transplanting that into patients. And what was really unique about that program is, I think, when the promise of regenerative medicine and cell therapy, right? We've gone through, for instance, various troughs and waves in gene therapy, right? And I think we're now now that we've seen some of the first gene therapies be approved for therapy for patients and to make dramatic impact, we're now beginning to see some real progress within the clinical trial development space for regenerative medicines and for stem cell biology to make really transformative cures, right? And I think that's what the difference between some of the way how we treat sort of medicine in general, right? And using, for instance, the progress that Blue Rock Therapeutics or Neurona Therapeutics has made within, for instance, Blue Rock is taking a dopamine neuron from stem cells into patients with Parkinson's disease, and they're beginning to show some very, very good efficacy data as well as safety data in a phase 1/2a clinical trial. So similarly, that's our hope with Vita Therapeutics. And then what was pretty interesting as well is we let it seed in Series A when I worked as an investment director at Cambrian Biopharma. And so Vita Therapeutics essentially raised its Series B round late or beginning of 2023. And we ended up getting Chip Wilson, the co-founder of Lululemon, to come into that company as well. And so that whole drug development process has been an interesting sort of tale from spinning out something from a Hopkins laboratory into a company.
So it's amazing you did that at age 15, to work with David Sassoon, who, as you say, is a bit of a legend. And the other thing is that for the audience as well, there's various different types of stem cells. And a lot of the therapies today are basically adult stem cells, where the iPSCs are a much earlier stage and have much greater potential. And Jess, you can decide whether you think the audience needs to hear more about that, or we can touch on some of Faizzan's other mentors and the work that they're doing in regeneration.
Yeah, I do think that would be great. Can you explain where an iPSC comes from? And can you also explain for non-science folks, like, what's the difference between a gene therapy and a cell therapy, and why should I care, or why is that exciting?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are terrific questions. In general, so gene therapy, right? When you're looking at particular genetic diseases, in some cases they might be rare and in others not. These are genes that are mutated in a way that gives you a pathological disease, right? And so, for instance, spinal muscular atrophy, right, is one such disease or indication that you can fix if you just give the right copy of a gene into a patient. And then, so that's one way of addressing a particular disease or problem. The other sort of way is to utilize stem cell biology for a potential cure, right? And so stem cell biology, as Greg pointed out, really comes in sort of two forms, right? One is using adult stem cells. So most of our organs in our body have resident stem cells that are there in case, but sort of there in case to potentially give rise to new tissue or new cells. But often is a very inefficient process, at least in humans, to be able to do that. And so that's why there was a big push in terms of, can we really look at the development of stem cells from a different source? And that source has, in 1996, was discovered to be human embryonic stem cells. And what they did was taking the inner cell mass of an embryo and be able to direct then that cell into various different cell types that you've lost or damaged. And so obviously that has ethical concerns with itself. And so there's been a strong push, and I guess one of the most exciting areas is this concept of reprogramming, and particularly epigenetic reprogramming as well. And so that sort of that work, foundational work, led to this sort of discovery by Shinya Yamanaka, who was at the time in Japan, creating using reprogramming factors or genes to revert, say, an adult cell. So you take a fibroblast, which is or a blood cell, and reverting them back into a stem cell state. So they operate just like embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are essentially totipotent cells that give rise to almost any cell type in the body. And so he was the first to demonstrate that you could do that with, say, a blood cell or a fibroblast cell, and then be able to, at scale, right, be able to make any type of tissue that you would want to, provided that you knew how to, right?
You know, it's funny how some of this stuff goes full circle. I had Chip Wilson on the show, and he talked about putting $100 million into this type of area to try and accelerate things like this. And for people, I know it's probably so basic for you guys, but like when you say they put this cell in someone, can you say like is this a needle? Is this a surgery? Like, give the rest of us context for how that goes into them. Is it a pill? What does that look like?
So right now, typically it's usually a transplantation of the cells, and at least from some of the stuff that I've been involved with, that's been the intended route. Obviously, in the future, when sort of drug delivery technologies, and Greg's working on a bunch of them, right, can potentially be modified to be amenable for cell therapies, and then figuring out sort of, obviously, I think there's probably a longer time horizon for that sort of technology to sort of meld with cellular therapeutics, right?
And sorry to go basic. When you say transplant, like, spell it out for somebody who doesn't know what that is. Like, are we cutting somebody open? Is this endoscopy? What is it? How do you transplant
indeed.
it?
And so one of the examples that I like to use comes from another former mentor, and I can give her a sort of some credit here, is a professor by the name of Sally Temple, and she's just phenomenal. And what she's done is she's actually taken adult stem cells, right? So adult RPE. So RPE is called retinal pigmented epithelium. And so it's this layer that in, for instance, age-related macular degeneration, you lose RPE progenitor cells. And that's how you go, that leads to blindness, right? And so in that instance, what she's been able to do is, because it's a very small sheet in the back of your eye that sort of give the tissue integrity in terms of the photoreceptors and the cones and rods and cones lining up to give you vision and color. You have that layer, and so what she's able to do is take a cadaver eye, for instance, isolate out the RP progenitors, expand them in a dish, and then prepare an appropriate dose for transplantation. And that's literally cutting into the eye through lasers, and then taking a needle and placing in the RP progenitor cells. And that
a lot is needles.
Yeah.
So if it's osteoarthritis and you're doing, and you're putting cells in, you literally just inject them. We have a company that Faizzan knows well called Regenerative, where under endoscopy, to your point, they take liver cells and inject them into the lymph nodes around the liver, called the paraduodenal lymph nodes, and they're able to turn those lymph nodes into a liver, which can keep somebody with liver failure alive when their liver is failing. So they literally, and it's done through injection, to your question, Jess.
And this is actually a good point. Is endoscopy where they put a tube down your throat, or is it any tube that goes in? What does endoscopy actually mean?
So endoscopy, for GI endoscopy, it's literally passing a tube down your throat. And then there's arthroscopy where I'm taking a scope and going into your knee. And so they often, with the stem cells, it's an ideal situation is to be able to literally visualize where you're about to put the cells. One of the great fears with regenerative medicine is, will the cells stray? So will I end up with tissue that would have made cartilage in my muscle in a not optimum situation? So it's nice when you have a contained entity like the eyeball with Dr. Temple or Professor Temple, or you have a knee, where you're putting it into a contained entity that has a barrier to the cells straying. Whereas opposed to if I was trying to do something into the abdominal cavity, it becomes much more problematic. So yes, there's anoscopes, there's endoscopes, there's arthroscopes, we have scopes. And
okay. Sometimes when you guys talk, I feel dumb. So I'm like, you know what? If I'm thinking about it, other people are wondering what it is.
Yeah, you're not dumb,
so
it's probably a good question.
Greg, back to you.
So we're sitting on what I would say is this momentous opportunity in endoscopy, or in regenerative medicine. And what I'm curious about is where are we headed and how can people invest in it? This is investing in longevity and biotech. And, do they have to invest really early, or can they do like Chip Wilson? Do they come in at that point? Is that available to people? How should they think about where they should invest in regeneration, and can they get in early stage, or do they have to wait a little longer? And by the way, you're able to put a plug in for yourself and how people might get in touch with you on LinkedIn if they want to understand better how to get in, if they want to get in early and not into, because there's very few publicly traded companies that are doing regeneration. Right. Sorry, that was like a Bill Clinton 22 aspect question.
It's a good thing he was a great communicator, as you are as well. Absolutely. And so, I guess I could sort of, there are public companies, very far and few in between, that operate in the regenerative medicine space, right? And so one of them is Sana Biotechnology. And they've got some interesting programs, particularly when it comes to evading the immune system, potentially. But there are, a lot of the work is still early. The most advanced companies, as I told you about, actually comes from a former mentor of mine named Lorenz Studer, who I had the privilege of working with when I was an undergraduate student in his lab, who's making dopamine neurons. And that's a private company that was funded and started by Bayer Ventures and Versant Ventures, and ended up being fully acquired by Bayer. And so that's a program that they're continuously moving forward. In terms of what I've been trying to deal with various stakeholders, is a company called Cure8bio. And Cure8bio is right now a private company, but the idea sort of is to be the regenerative medicine company, hub and spoke, where we have multiple assets under our umbrella. And so the idea, again, we're building a company around the idea of reengineering cells, and we'd want to approach it from a lens where we could be agnostic, right? And if the cell was still alive, we could fix it in vivo, be able to modify the cell inside the body. And if the cells were, too far gone or already missing, be able to grow one ex vivo and replace what's missing, right? And so typically people go in, one direction or another track, but it turns out that most of the capabilities we need to build are highly synergistic and utilizable across both platforms, where both areas consist of modifying cells, but the risks are pretty idiosyncratic, which is great from a portfolio construction perspective.
Ex vivo is growing the cells outside the body and then putting these new, fresh, healthy cells into the body, which is what I was talking about with that company Ligenesis, where they're taking healthy liver cells and putting them into somebody whose liver is failing and degenerating. And at the end of this presentation, we'll make sure that you provide an opportunity for the audience to actually reach out to you to learn more or to see where you see the opportunities are on a more one-to-one basis. What's the sexiest thing you're seeing right now in the sector? Is there one that is going to be transformative?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the most, and this is like the most advanced work so far that I think will have transformative potential is the work, for instance, from Neurona as well, right? And Neurona Therapeutics is a California company, started by actually one of my former mentors' mentor.
How many mentors do you have, lad?
I've been fortunate. As I said, I've been fortunate. So Stuart Anderson is a person I worked with in collaboration with Lorenz when I was working on. Although Lorenz's lab focuses on the dopamine neuron side, Stuart focused on the GABAergic interneuron space. And so GABAergic interneurons, just for the non-science folks, is the major inhibitory neuron in the brain, right? And so, for instance, when you get sort of those tremors in Parkinson's disease, right, those movement disabilities, it's because of a result of the loss of GABAergic interneurons. And so it's a result of a loss of your inhibitory neuron in your brain. And that happens because as a consequence of Parkinson's disease, you don't have any more dopamine neurons. And so when the dopamine neurons stop synapsing on the GABAergic interneurons, they start to spaz out and go, we don't have any signal, right? What's my purpose here? And so that's what typically happens. And so, but what the company is doing is taking that sort of philosophy and going after epileptic seizures. And so, folks who have epilepsy, their inhibitory tone is different, and so and that's why they keep seizing. And so, if you increase the GABAergic interneuron population in the brain, you're able to then quell epilepsy. And so and they're currently also in a phase 1/2A clinical trial. And so that's very exciting. And so obviously some of the other areas that I think are pretty exciting is what the CRISPR world, for instance, is doing, right? And so the idea that you can genetically modify in the context, whether you can do it in vivo or ex vivo, right? In vivo being you genetically modify a cell or a DNA in the human body, or you can take out cells, make them into stem cells, right, and then differentiate into whatever cell type you need for a particular disease. But in that process, you're modifying that cell line. And so one of the strategies, for instance, that Vita's undertaken is they're working with autologous stem cells, right? And so there's a whole other discussion between autologous and allogeneic and where the field is at currently. But just to sort of give you a synopsis of it is the way we see, for instance, muscular disorders being cured, for instance, right now without having a hypoimmune strategy in place that's working. Although, as I mentioned earlier, Sana is working on that along with a few other folks as well. But so the only way to do it, so autologous transplantation is going to be what's likely, right? Right now. And so
autologous and allogeneic.
Autologous transplantation is taking cells from your own body. So a patient say, I have limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, right? I take a blood cell from my cell that has a mutation for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And so the cells that I make from there, when I convert them back into a stem cell, are going to be defective anyway, right? And so what you then have to do is you have to use gene editing technology to fix that mutation in that cell, and then you can make massive amounts of muscle stem cells and then transplant them back into me. And that's sort of, I think, sort of the correlation, the interlays between, and the synergies between different technologies converging into one is where I think there's going to be massive potential, right? And that's true for even what the pandemic made famous in terms of RNA biology, right? The convergence of RNA biology, of CRISPR, gene editing, and stem cell biology is going to probably create possible tomorrows for all of us, right?
I'm going to just punch things for the audience. Autologous is, as Faizzan's saying, taking his cells, modifying them and injecting them back into them. allogenic is taking Faizzan cells, modifying them and injecting them into Jess. So Jess is not getting his, and because those cells are not compatible with Jess's immune system, we have to suppress it. But there are companies working on that. And from an audience perspective, again, as far as thinking about investing in this and going, whoa, I don't understand CRISPR. CRISPR is very simple. It's scissors that cut the DNA and allow us to then replace a portion of the DNA. So there's a number of diseases where there's a single gene that is malfunctioning, hemophilia. And if I just go and cut that, I can inject, put in a healthy one to prevent that disease. That's cystic fibrosis. So, and then a bunch of them are multi-genes, and then it's very problematic. I mean, we'll get there probably with quantum computing, where we'll be able to do this. The other thing that I would point out is, I'm going to turn this back over to you, Jess, so you can ask a couple of questions on that area. And then I have an idea I want to run by you, Faizzan.
Well, my big question is this. For my friends who are outside the industry and they're seeing things are changing. The Buck Institute's been working on things for aging for 25 years. But now, like you guys have said, there's all this momentum. There's these technologies are converging. There's, it just feels so obvious that there's something different now. If you were going to talk to folks who have not been biotech investors in the past and they're thinking about it now, and they're saying, well, why now? Why is now a good time to get in? What would be a couple of your thoughts there, Faizzan?
No, absolutely. I think the idea that there's been exponential growth in terms of the innovation that we're now making compared to what we were doing, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that I think sort of will push us towards making it more equitable to invest into biotech, right? And part of that is also in terms of there's just now, the technological innovation and the pace at which it's growing it's gonna decrease the cost of capital required to make a new drug, right? For instance, to make potential, potential democratization of cell therapies, right? So there's companies working on automating that whole process. And so what that's inevitably going to do is it's going to decrease the cost of capital required to make a new live medicine, for instance.
And for you, what are a small handful of those stack that have now made this exponentially faster and less expensive? What are those technologies that have combined?
Yes, absolutely. So, for instance, CRISPR technology has already been starting to have been used. mRNA biology as well. As Greg pointed out, scissor cutting, right? And then obviously the influx of data that we get from AI to make more precision medicines, right? That's going to be one layer. Another thing that's already happening, and there's a number of companies doing this now, is automating the whole cell manufacturing process, right? And cell and gene, right? It's a heavy capital requirement industry, right? And there are ways, and this is, I guess, putting in another plug-in for myself. There are ways in which we're thinking how to decrease the cost of capital, right? And one of the ways that we pursue at Cure8bio for any program that we enter into, right? We go after non-dilutive funding because, again, the work is very early, right? But has so much tremendous transformative potential for a potential cure that the work has to be done. And so how do we interlay that with investment dollars, with grant funding from state agencies? And so together, I think all of those things are converging at the right time to make that exponential leap in this space.
That's so great. Greg, back to you.
So as far as thinking about this, tell me if this could be done. So I take CRISPR, I marry it with a gene, with a virus that it can be inhaled. And so the virus, you breathe it in, CRISPR is brought into the system and does its editing. Can that work?
So conceptually, this is a tough one, Greg, particularly from some of the ethical ramifications that could come about from this, right? But in theory, right, I think we could potentially do that. Now, obviously, the technologies um, have obviously gotten better over the years in terms of some of the inhalation therapeutics that the industry has made. Can you marry that with say viral technology to gene edit a particular cell? No one's shown that together yet, but a lot of it is probably very tricky waters.
It's a
You're gonna get me in
huge,
trouble, Greg.
well, you're not doing it, and you and I are not doing it, so we don't have to worry about it quite yet. And as you say, the science isn't there. But this is mind-boggling, Jess. I mean, just to stimulate the audience again, is the aspect that I could potentially give a viral spray to somebody I want to fall in love with me that would gene edit and make them express oxytocin and fall in love with me, or change the color of their eyes. It is, and monster ethical issues. But just to give people a vision of what the future may hold. Now, the flip side of that is, that I could also do this to mitigate a disease, and use the same technology. But this is the dilemma that we find ourselves in medicine is there's two sides to every coin. I guess the classic one that everybody's confronting right now is AI. AI, can it be like the Terminator, or can it make the world a perfect place? And which path does it go down for humanity? But it's extraordinary what's coming. And Faizzan and people like him who are trying to put together capital to accelerate this is so very, very important to the industry. And from an investor standpoint, and this, I really want to punch this, we might even reiterate it at the end of this, is you may be listening to it going, oh, I don't understand allogeneic, I don't understand autologous and CRISPR, scissors, I don't quite get it. If you see extraordinary people like David Sassoon or Faizzan or Professor Temple, who are working on a project, to get where they've gotten, to get the dilutive grant money from the government, they have to jump through so many hoops. So it's being vetted by people much smarter than me anyway, as to the application. And so by the time it gets there, that there's some pretty heavy duty science. And always look for who's investing alongside you. If it's somebody like Faizzan and Cure8bio, he's done deep diligence. And I'm hopeful that more people can get exposed to it or participate through a limited partnership GP to do this, because the acceleration of this process and the ability to modify things is extraordinary. I had a woman on a business opportunity. She said, by the way, I'm a cancer survivor, and she talked about it. And, and her early breast cancer in her case, she said, well, I don't have a gene profile. When she told me her gene, she probably does have a gene profile for this. So then would be this opportunity to do what Faizzan, two aspects, come at it from the gene side, come at it from the cellular side, to be able to mitigate the disease. And so it's just this incredible frontier. I don't want it to sound like Captain Kirk on Star Trek, but we're boldly going in some pretty extraordinary directions. Faizzan, please edit what I just said.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think when it comes to the transformative potential of these medicines and what they can be with these stacking different various technologies, and how we can make an impact on really, really debilitating medical conditions and diseases and unmet needs, right? And it's one thing that, I mean, I want to point out, one thing that you brought up earlier in the conversation when it comes to the GLP-1s and what they're going to do, right? And so if you're looking at the impact of GLP-1s, they're going to clearly have impact on insulin resistance, inflammation, right? Some of the things that are coordinated by obesity and whatnot, and metabolic syndrome, right? And so in theory, right? Theoretically, you're going to have the disappearance of a whole host of indications, right? Called, for instance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease will decrease, certain cancers, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, NASH, gallbladder problems, GERD and PCOS and things like that. And so when you then really begin to think about, okay, well, there's still going to be other diseases that you're going to have to go after, right? Particularly one that you point out to is, you still have muscle wasting with GLP-1. And so you're still going to have a muscle problem, right? And so how do you set up the trajectory to be able to tackle those types of problems, right? And I think, for instance, regenerative medicine lies at that interface, that you're really able to push that frontier forward.
Very well put. Jess, I threw a couple of curveballs in there. Where would you like to go?
Well, I think part of why I'm so excited about this, and I would love for you to both to weigh in on see if you see it differently, is, I looked up. My grandpa was born in 1922. Life expectancy in the U.S. was 54 for men, and 60 for women, and that had come up 10 years from a decade earlier. From 44 to 54, and now 100 years we've jumped life expectancies another 20 years in the States. It's 74 for men and 80 for women, and you guys talk about these things like, what if diabetes completely went away, right? Well, look, tuberculosis, polio, like these are not the things that are killing us now. The previous iterations of biotech and, have created medicines to take care of those kind of, even pneumonia does not kill people like it used to. The reason we are all dying at 54 and 60 are not why we're dying now. And we've lived long enough to the next things, which are these chronic diseases you guys have talked about. So for me, it just doesn't sound like crazy talk to think, oh, well, people will figure out these ones too. And then we'll live, another, 10, 20 years longer again. And then we'll figure out what kills people at that point, and we'll start working on those ones. And it doesn't, I don't know. I guess it just feels more and more reasonable what you guys are saying. I'm interested if you think my model thinking about it is wrong, or what you both edit. Do you want to go first, Faizzan, and then Greg?
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you on that, right? And that's along the same lines that we just talked about in the previous question. Is we're gonna make incremental progress, right? Technological innovation, right? That will grow exponentially, and we're going to make incremental progress going this way. Eventually, that's going to sort of will add up to be transformative in extending, a healthy human lifespan. And I think that's how typically, and there'll be periods of where there's going to be rapid innovation and a little bit of a slowdown, and then again rapid innovation, and that's sort of going to add up to improving the quality of life and health of individuals. And as you grow older, I agree with you. You're likely going to have other sort of conditions that are going to need the technology that we talked about today on the podcast, right? To really think about how to extend that even further.
So I'll add in the following things. Had you invested in the GLP-1s, which became Ozempic, Mounjaro, which are predicted to do $100 to $150 billion a year in annual sales, have turned Novo Nordisk, one of the players, into the second most highest market cap company in Europe after LVMH, have made Eli Lilly a $1 trillion company. Those are the opportunities we're speaking about, is why, as an investor, you need to think about this as part of your portfolio. The other thing I'll say, riffing off of what Faizzan thinks, is most people think that it's going to be incrementally in a nice, steady thing. It's a step curve. So something comes through, we unlocked the human genome, we jumped. We're motoring along now, and computers have made us jump again a few years ago. COVID made us jump as far as medical change because so much money came into the industry. I think quantum computing is going to be a huge jump. So it won't be linear. There's incredible opportunities. And the things that Faizzan and his group and the regenerative medicine people are working on are that step opportunity at this point in time, which is why this is so compelling. And to your question about the 20 years, and will it be, basically it was 2 years a decade, starting in the 50s, where we started to add 2 years a decade, mostly because of infectious diseases, as you rightly point out, Jess. And we just knocked off a huge one in the last 20 years, which is hepatitis C, which is a huge, huge problem. So is the chance, and I had a very animated discussion with Aubrey de Grey about this because he claims that we probably reached escape velocity for people your age, that you are going to live forever because he thinks that for every year we live, science will add 2 years. And there was a very interesting study done by Fahey and Horvath out of UCLA where they gave people a concoction of drugs and were able to, according to one of the biometrics of aging, knock off 2 years in 1 year of treatment. But I haven't seen it being repeated the last 2 years yet. But is there, there's great argument. Are we programmed for ourselves to say, okay, enough's enough. We've been here 150 years. We're checking out. So we're done. Doesn't matter what you do. Forget disease. We're, just wear and tear. We're going to go down. And what I would say is that we don't know that that's true. So to Aubrey's point, we may be able to extend that. With what Faizzan is doing, even if the cell decides it's quitting, other than it's your brain, I can replace or regenerate every other tissue, which goes to what Ray Kurzweil says, that you're going to have by 2045 or 2050, you're going to have the choice between a wet body or a dry body. Either I'm going to be able to be a cyborg where my thoughts and brains have been put into this entity, or my brain's been put into that entity, or I can have a wet body where I've regenerated, myself back to age 25. So it's fascinating what happened, but each of these opportunities as an investor is extraordinary. I mean, if Faizzan had something that allowed you to regenerate your body parts, he's got a multi-trillion-dollar company. It's that sort of incredible upside. Would I invest 100% of my money in biotech, which I probably am, but most people don't. I would say that, you should definitely, 1% is not crazy talk, and if you're right, you just change the trajectory for yourself and everyone you love along the way. And I know I've been pounding away at this on various editions of this show, but it's that compelling, and people like Faizzan who are so passionate about the area. Faizzan, back to you. What do we need to do to make this happen?
Absolutely. I think so. There's collating sort of the funding opportunities and sources. And I just want to sort of point out that there's obviously been tremendous initiatives started, whether you look at the Middle East in terms of Revolution Foundation, as well as the other players within the longevity space. One I'm particularly close with is obviously Qatar, and Qatar, for instance, as more Arabically put, is an interesting player in the space. I think as they so part of my bio that we may have left out before the banking and the venture world was I actually set up a stem cell core facility at Cornell's branch. So Cornell University had a branch campus in Doha, in Qatar. And so I set up a stem cell core facility at Cornell's branch campus, which later then morphed into a larger initiative, part of Qatar Foundation. And they've done phenomenal work in terms of, giving sort of Western education access to folks in the Middle East. And so they built that infrastructure from an academic perspective, and are probably at the cusp of translating that into transformational opportunities, right? When taking their basic science research that we helped establish back in 2010, 2012, 2015, and converting that. And so I think you'll see sort of a big push from an investment perspective from Qatar as well. And then you obviously have Abu Dhabi, who's done some phenomenal work in the investing space as well. And so all of this sort of collating with making a more global world, right? And I think one of the things as I've learned as an entrepreneur, right, is it doesn't really matter where you are, because you can work from anywhere now, right, essentially. And we're so globally connected, even though, there is, the political climate might be a little bit different in various places. The world and how we see it is all the same, right? And so, bridging that divide that we kind of sort of put sort of unharmoniously, I guess, on ourselves is going to be an important part into galvanizing, I think, the longevity field as well, and biotechnology in general. I think obviously computers and supercomputing and various other sort of technological leaps has made it even more possible for us to collaborate across borders. And so I think putting together a sort of concerted approach, a concentrated approach for longevity, regenerative medicine, and biotech in general is going to be an extremely important endeavor to help propel the space forward, and to help propel, reaching every patient around the globe.
Jess.
Well, this is great. Thanks for spending your time, Faizzan, with us. Obviously, LinkedIn's probably a pretty great way to connect with you. That's how you and I met, because I appreciate you reaching out to me on LinkedIn, and I don't know if you knew Greg already and all this, so it's kind of fun for it to come full circle. And congratulations on the success. Sometimes in these conversations, I start getting a little bit lost with the terminology, and then it comes back around, and I'm like, oh, no wonder they were so excited. That's what it meant. And so it's like a roller coaster for me every one of these episodes. I love it, and I appreciate you and what you're trying to accomplish in the world. It's actually a benefit to all society. So
absolutely, it's a privilege and pleasure. Again, meeting you, Jess, and just out of probably through because of your connection with Greg. Greg, who I've known for some time now, but I've been fascinated by the work that you put together. And by the work that you're continuing to do for the longevity space. And I think it's going to be brilliant, and really, really, pushing you more and more, and rooting for you to continue going.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We'll call it there.